Our job as medical examiners is to find out what happened, not who done it. As soon as we start thinking who done it, maybe subconsciously we'll be making our scientific findings match that.
Forensic pathologist Michael Baden today on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson. Crime solving in the 21st century has become all about the science. If you go back and look at old TV shows or movies from the 50s or the 60s, even into the 70s, you soon realize that just dusting for fingerprints or taking a few crime scene photos just isn't enough anymore. Because today, police and prosecutors have a wide array of very sophisticated technology at their fingertips. And one of those who's been around long enough to see that evolution take place and to participate in it is the renowned and sometimes controversial forensic pathologist Michael Baden. He's been involved in one way or another, either in an official role or as a private consultant in some of the most high-profile homicides of our time, including most notably, perhaps, the O.J. Simpson case. Now, in 2001, Baden wrote a book called Dead Reckoning, in which he detailed his findings in some of those very high-profile cases, including the O.J. Simpson case. Now, he and I talked about his book in the fall of 2001, and it was just a few weeks after the September 11th attacks, which you will hear us reference in this interview. In just a moment, my conversation with Michael Baden.
Have you ever opened a time capsule? You're about to. This interview is from national radio personality Bill Thompson's 30-year interview archive. Enjoy.
So here now from 2001, forensic pathologist Michael Baden.
There's been so many advances in the forensic sciences, beginning with DNA. But there's so many things other than DNA, hairs and fibers and maggots, and have such big stories to tell now that weren't dreamed of 10 years ago. And I think that the O.J. Simpson case really raised people's consciousness about the importance of the crime scene, the importance of forensic science. So we've sort of built on that to see if we could educate the public about to explain the ways of medical examiners to man.
And if anybody thinks that every little detail isn't important, they should go to the center of this book and look at the photograph you have in here of Nicole Brown Simpson, the spots of blood on her back as she lay dead on the ground. Why was that so critical, and what happened in that case?
What happened with Nicole Simpson, when one looks at the photographs, and photography is probably the oldest and still the most important of crime scene tools, there are low-velocity blood drops on her back that had to have come from somebody standing over her who was dripping blood from a hand or so. If that blood turned out to be that of O.J. Simpson, end of case. If it turned out to be somebody else's blood, that would be an important investigation tool that would be should be followed up. But instead, not only was the crime scene messed up by too many people walking around it and not being protected, but the next area when evidence usually gets botched up is in the movement of the body from the crime scene to the morgue. When they put the body in the body bag to move it to the morgue. And when Nicole Simpson was turned over onto her back and put into the body bag, all that wonderful evidence that was documented photographically was lost and was rubbed away. Other blood came down, so it couldn't be used. If those drops of blood had been looked at, had been protected from the crime scene, the case may have been over very quickly. But it's just an example of how the technology, the ability to analyze evidence is way ahead of our ability to protect it and preserve it and identify it in the first place.
Well, it occurred to me, if I was watching this story on TV, there would be some grizzled detective type who would tell somebody like you, well, it's fine, you sitting here 2 years later, 6 years later saying we should have done that, but we were out there, we were the first one, we had to deal with all this, spur of the moment.
Speaking about grizzled detectives, see, I thought the very important part of the O.J. Simpson trial was when Marcia Clark asked Detective Van Adder, who's an old-time, very good homicide detective, And she says to him, "You don't wear a hairnet and booties when you go to a crime scene." And he said, "Of course not. Old grizzled detectives don't do that. But let me tell you, we do a lot of teaching to young cops and young detectives, and I do a lot of teaching with New York State Police. The young recruits, they understand this. You got to protect the crime scene. You got to wear booties. You got to wear a hairnet, because if you contaminate that scene, the evidence is not good anymore. When you go to the crime lab, everybody's wearing a hairnet and booties. What good is that if it hasn't been protected in the first place?" It's the old grizzled detectives that say, "Hey, we didn't do it that way when I was a young cop, so I'm not going to change my ways." But I mean, people are beginning to appreciate. Jurors appreciate it. Judges appreciate it. Prosecutors appreciate it, and more and more detectives and police are appreciating. You've got to protect the crime scene. You can't allow any contamination or even the appearance that something could be contaminated.
And, of course, it helps if you've got some experience to deal with, because you talk about in the book the Jean-Benet Ramsey case. Yeah. Here are detectives who maybe have, 2 or 3 homicides a year to deal with?
Yeah, I think what bothers me about something like Jean-Benet Ramsey, where you have one homicide every couple of years, it's like doing heart surgery. If somebody's going to do heart surgery nowadays in the United States, you can't do one a year at a hospital. It won't be accredited because you have to have a team of people, nurses, anesthesiologists, the surgeons, internists, all the different specialty people have to work together as a team. And in most states, in order to be able to do heart surgery, the team has to do at least 10 or 20 a year to be accredited. Same thing should be with homicides. When there's a murder, there's a whole team of people, the first officer on the scene, the crime lab people, the medical examiner, the prosecutor, the various types of detectives and all. They have to work together as a team. And I think there isn't going to be enough expertise. There are only 300 medical examiners, forensic pathologists in the whole country. So there should be some regionalization. So if something happens in Boulder, Colorado, there should be no turf problem in saying, "Hey, let's work together with the Denver team that does this every day." And I think what happened with O.J. Simpson, what happened with Jean-Benet Ramsey, looks to be, to the public, like an anecdotal deviation from normal practice, when it isn't. The tragedy about those cases, it's the usual way still that most murders are investigated in this country. And we'll have 50 murders in this country today, and 40% of them aren't going to be solved. And that's because, in great measure, we haven't brought the crime scene investigation, the forensic pathologist investigation, up to the standard it should be. It's really a national disgrace, and that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, is that we have to have some kind of we have a Surgeon General who's tries to be a bully pulpit for natural disease, heart disease and alcoholism and cigarette smoking awareness. There should be a bully pulpit to say, hey, solving murders, investigating deaths, having a standard. How do you identify everybody at the World Trade Center? It should be a national priority, and it isn't.
Well, you talk about something similar. You talk about the TWA Flight 800.
Yes.
Which is broadly similar to what we have at the World Trade Center,
That's
where
right.
you had lots of bodies. You weren't sure you're going to be able to identify everything. I'm sure. Now, the other thing is, I'm sure you finished this manuscript. It probably went to press long before September 11th. Otherwise, that would have been a fascinating chapter. But still, that has to be a horrifyingly difficult task to try to identify people from a little bit of tissue.
Yeah, Bill, you're absolutely right. What's interesting, though, and the satisfaction one gets out of it, is the ability to bring closure to a family. Chandra Levy is part of your concerns here.
Judge Crater and Jimmy Hoffa.
But even with Chandra, that's right. But Chandra Levy, the poor family, wants to put closure. What happened to their daughter? We have 4,000 families in New York City who want to put closure, and they can't put closure. But the history of DNA is very short. Only 12 or 13 years ago that was used in a homicide. When ValueJet crashed in around 1996, early part, there were about 50% of the decedents were not identified. About 5 months later, when TWA crash occurred, that I described in the book, there were 230 people on the plane. 208 were identified by traditional means. Fingerprints, dental records, X-ray comparisons, tattoos. There were 22 that could not be identified. It was the first mass disaster of this type that we applied DNA, and all 22 body parts were identified using DNA and comparing it to the DNA of the relatives of the missing person. A year or two later, when Swiss Air crashes off Newfoundland, there are 229 people in that plane. Everybody's fragmented, except for one person. One body was intact. All is fragmented. They couldn't be identified by conventional means. All of those bodies, all those body parts were identified by DNA. So that all 229 people who would not have been identified otherwise were identified. So I think the power of DNA to identify people is great. In the World Trade Center, even if they're tiny little bits of tissue, or if decomposition sets in, as it's setting in now, and as time goes on, bodies can get very decomposed. But DNA doesn't. DNA stays intact. So that there is hope. Part of the concern of the firemen who had a scuffle with the police the other day was they want to get the bodies or the body parts of their comrades so the families can bring closure. And it isn't correct to say they all vaporize. Bodies don't vaporize. They're there, but in larger or smaller pieces.
After this short break, Michael Baden tells us who is now the most important person at a crime scene.
Are you enjoying this conversation so far?
And would you like to get a copy of the book we're talking about?
Just tap the link in our show notes or visit our website, heardeverything.com.
When you make a purchase through our affiliate links, you're also supporting this podcast.
And we thank you for your support.
Now back to my 2001 conversation with Michael Baden.
It occurred to me, though, there's a two-edged sword in being able to do so much with science. It's the same thing as in modern medicine. They say, well, gee, if they can find this way to do that, why can't they cure the common cold? And if you can find a killer with a speck of blood or a hair or a button impression on a body, why can't we solve the JonBenet Ramsey case? You know, people make that leap.
Well, sure. The JonBenet Ramsey case may still be solved, but it could have been solved much easier if the crime scene had been protected. And it isn't good enough to say they thought it was a kidnapping. Even if it was a kidnapping, you want to keep the crime scene protected, because how did the kidnapper get in? How did the kidnapper get out? So the most important person with all this PhD, Nobel Prize winning technologies that we have on DNA and other things, the most important person now in the whole scheme of things becomes the first officer who responds to the crime scene. Usually the least experienced person in the squad is the one who responds first to protect the crime scene. And as long as that crime scene is protected, then little bits and pieces of material can be obtained. But as I say, in most of the murders today in the United States, that's not going to happen. They don't have the manpower, they don't have the knowledge to protect the scene, to identify trace evidence, to protect and document it and bring it to the laboratory. That all takes time, and that's one of the reasons that the JonBenet Ramsey case and O.J. Simpson case have really stimulated the desire for police departments all over the country to get more training in forensic science, something they didn't have in the past.
And it wouldn't be nice if everything could be solved in 1 hour like it is on TV.
It doesn't happen like that under any circumstance.
But now many of us have started watching this new show on Monday, Crossing Jordan, and we're thinking, all right, well that's fine. We know it's fiction. All right, that's fine. But she does something in that show that you caution against. She seems to be a prosecution witness. She seems to be looking for the bad guys. And you said in your book that the medical examiner cannot be a prosecutor.
Right.
Or on the prosecution team.
That's right. Oh, actually, with Crossing Jordan, sometimes she's exonerating people.
That's true.
Well. So what she is...
And she's being beautiful doing it, too.
She's great. What it is she becomes the detective in the case. But you see, as I caution, our job as medical examiners is to find out what happened, not who done it. As soon as we start thinking who done it, maybe subconsciously we'll be making our scientific findings match that. So they're two different things. However, in order for the public to look at this stuff, we start off with Quincy. Quincy did the same thing. Now, he was exonerating people as well. He would say, like Sherlock Holmes said, you got the wrong guy sometimes. But Quincy would be the scientist and the detective. Crossing Jordan, Jordan is the scientist and the detective. I think in real life it doesn't work that way because there's too much of a conflict. Even here in Maryland, you have Kay Scarpetta, who's the medical examiner, who's the detective, and also gets personally involved and gets threatened and all that kind of stuff. Real medical examiners don't get threatened. In part, I must say, I've been up with a lot of organized crime, mafia types, and you get on the stand, and then you could look at the guy you're testifying for the prosecution who's in the dock, and it's just, look, he knows I'm doing my job. I know he's doing his job. Nothing personal.
Now, you also said in the book that you'd rather be, if you're going to be testifying, you'd rather be testifying against somebody like Cyril Wecht than some emergency room physician.
Yeah, I think what's important is oftentimes bad testimony comes in because people get involved who aren't knowledgeable about forensic science. For example, John F. Kennedy's assassination. A lot of people got involved because saying that he was shot a large hole in the back of his head. This was wrong. There wasn't a large hole in the back of his head, but the unexperienced real hospital doctors and all the attendant doctors and all confused what appeared to be a hole with just a lot of blood on the hair. There was a lot of blood in the hair, but once it was washed off, there was no hole underneath it. Now, a person like Cyril Wecht, who's a fine forensic pathologist from out in Pittsburgh, would understand that. Whereas an emergency room doctor may not. And often we get conflicts in the courtroom because a physician forensic pathology is a very strict science. It isn't, to me, to start talking about neurosurgery as a pathologist would be like a neurosurgeon trying to make out like a forensic pathologist. The different expertises. We all have the mantle of being a physician on us. So the idea is we can say anything we want to say, and I think that's why so many mistakes occur in the courtroom, because some physicians speak beyond their expertise.
So maybe that's why why lay people enjoy reading a story like this, because there is a certain scientific precision to what you do, and the outcome, what we hope, is justice as a result of that very precision. It's what drew us to the Sherlock Holmes stories to begin with.
That's right. And remember, Sherlock Holmes was based on a physician.
That's right.
From the medical school days. But what's interesting is I have on this autopsy series I do with HBO, we have a website. I'm right in between Sopranos and Sex and the City. And one of the most common questions I'm asked on that website is, my son is interested in being a police officer. What do you suggest? The most important thing now to be a police officer, I think, is to take good science courses and to get a background in science. The days of just coming in and being a good talker and getting a confession from somebody are getting to be over with, because you can get bad confessions out of people too. And where science is impartial and science, tells the truth in a way that we can't in our normal thinkings. So I think science becomes a very important part of going to the criminal justice system.
Michael Baden is 90 now. Now you can get your copy of Dead Reckoning by Michael Baden by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're listening to this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. Heardeverything.com is where you can also find my 1997 interview with the lead prosecutor in the O.J. Simpson case, Marcia Clark.
It was clear to me what went wrong before the case ever started. From the first questionnaires that the jurors filled out, they would not let go of this image of the affable, nice guy in the Hertz commercial, this all-American hero.
And my 1991 conversation with crime writer and the creator of the Kay Scarpetta character, Patricia Cornwell.
All of my plots are rooted usually in the commonplace and randomness. And that, of course, is what's so frightening, because we'd rather think it's a Dean Koontz or Stephen King type monster out there who's very clever and supernatural. Somehow that would make us feel a little more immune if we knew it wasn't as commonplace as the person who pumps gas for you.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can find us everywhere you find podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, an amazing first-person story by a soldier wounded, gravely wounded in World War II, who went on to some degree of fame as a political figure and presidential candidate. My 2005 conversation with former senator, former GOP presidential nominee, and World War II hero, Bob Dole.
A lot of people say Bob Dole, his right arm is useless. Well, that's true, but that's only a tip of the iceberg. I've learned to cope and adapt and had a great life, and you kind of forget about all that stuff.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.